How much do Americans know about the 1968 presidential election? Likely very little, and don't worry, I didn't know very much about it either until I read today's guest's work. Today I'm pleased to welcome Luke Nichter, professor of history at Chapman University, to discuss why all of us should know about that year. I'm Julie Hartman, and this is Timeless. Hey everyone, and welcome to Timeless. I hope that you're having a great week. Just a reminder to hit the subscribe button down below so that you can stay notified with every new video we post. Dennis and Julie, my show with Dennis Prager, premieres every Monday on this channel, and Timeless is Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays. I'm pleased to welcome Luke Nichter to the program. He is a professor of history and a James H. Kavanaugh Endowed Chair in Presidential Studies at Chapman University. He specializes in the Cold War, the modern presidency, and U.S. political and diplomatic history with a focus on the long 1960s from John F. Kennedy through Watergate. Mr. Nichter has filed over 2,000 Freedom of Information Act requests for the purpose of opening historically important records to the public. One such case actually resulted in the government declassifying many records concerning the Watergate break-in of 1972. His website, nixontapes.org, has the largest declassified volume of President Nixon tapes, probably known to man. Mr. Nichter is a New York Times best-selling author or editor of 8 books, including, most recently, The Year That Broke Politics, Collusion and Chaos in the Presidential Election of 1968. Hello, Mr. Nichter. Welcome to Timeless.
Thanks. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you for driving down from Orange County to sit across from me and talk about your fantastic book, which I so enjoyed and learned an immense amount from. And I appreciate that you made it understandable in addition to conveying really an immense amount of information. So for those who are listening and know nothing about 1968, including who was even involved in the election, what is your synopsis of that year?
Oh, I think that was a year in 1968 where obviously the nation was divided. The two political parties were divided in terms of their path forward. And people around the country and around the world were just simply stirred up. We had gone through the culture wars, to use that term, in this country in the 1960s. Similar culture wars were occurring in Europe. The Chinese Cultural Revolution was taking place in the People's Republic of China. You had apartheid in South Africa, the nation's longest war in Southeast Asia with 500,000 troops deployed there in Vietnam. So just around home and around the world was just an exceptionally divisive time in American history.
Mm-hmm. So let's go to the election. Who were the players involved?
So this book focuses on the 4 sides. So we have outgoing President Lyndon Johnson. We have his Vice President Hubert Humphrey, who becomes the Democratic nominee that year. We have, as we knew him then, the former Vice President Richard Nixon, who had run unsuccessfully in 1960 and lost to John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson, and he would become the Republican nominee later that year. And then we have the real wild card of which I think is one of the most interesting aspects of the whole election, which is former and future Governor of Alabama George Wallace, who would play a really almost a decisive factor in terms of not winning the election, but the possibility of denying a victory to one of the other major parties. So you have those are the 4 candidates, and I think one of the things that strikes me so much about this year is how much the issues and the campaign really resonates going into 2024 as well.
Why do you say that?
Well, I mean, just look at recent events. A candidate named Robert Kennedy has declared he's running as an independent. The Democrats are going back to presumably a chaotic convention in Chicago. Republicans wonder, they're desperate to claw back the White House, but some are concerned whether their nominee might be a loser who could bring the party down with him. And in the midst of all that is a very unpopular president who's being challenged by the left wing of his party, wondering whether he has it in him to run again, whether he should step aside and let someone else run. And you look at those points, you say to yourself, is it 1968 or 2024?
Yes, very well said. Whatever you think about Lyndon Johnson, it's heartbreaking for him to look at what happened in 1968, where he was considering very strongly rerunning for the presidency after, of course, coming to office with the assassination of John F. Kennedy, 1963, excuse me, through 1968. And then he bowed out. He decided not to seek re-election. A lot of people have a lot of different theories about why that was. What's your theory?
The theory for about 50 years in most of the history books was that he went on national television on March 31st, and in a speech that was otherwise about Vietnam, it was responding to the Tet Offensive, which was sort of this coordinated attack on multiple cities in South Vietnam, right at a time when the American people were being told that the war was going better for the United States and its allies. This coordinated surprise attack made people wonder, how could it be going better if the enemy, the communists, were able to do this? Mm-hmm. So at the end of a speech about Vietnam, Johnson has this surprise ending where he says, I'm not going to run again, I will not accept the nomination of my party, and that effectively throws the race wide open. So that was March 31st, which again gives us some historical context for what might be going through President Biden's mind in terms of how a decision might be made, whether he could surprise us in 2024, just as Johnson did in '68 and Truman did in 1952. There are two parallels to the decision that Biden has to face, both modern Democrats, both pressured by the left wing of their parties, and probably both cases, given Biden's age, that he remembers personally.
Mm-hmm. So, again, making the parallels really clear, because it is, frankly, astonishing. So we have Richard Nixon, who is this kind of bombastic, either totally loved or totally reviled Republican figure in '68, who is looking like he probably will be the president. Of course, he's secured the Republican nomination. We have Donald Trump today, who is a similar kind of figure who looks like he's going to secure the nomination and be the president. We have a Democratic president in '68, Lyndon Johnson, whose popularity was dwindling amid a crisis, and he bows out in large part because of health issues. And now, of course, we have a Democratic president with a very similar thing. We don't know if he's going to bow out because of health issues, but we wouldn't all be shocked. So going to '68, and then with an eye towards what might happen in 2024, when Lyndon Johnson bows out, that's when George Wallace ascends. First, why was it particularly George Wallace who ascended? And who might you think, if President Biden bows out in 2024, might be the George Wallace who replaces him?
I think it's a great question. I think Wallace ran as an independent. This is something that as Americans, we don't see except for maybe once a generation. You'd have to go back to maybe Ross Perot of '92 in terms of someone who could actually be decisive. Now, Perot, I think, polled as high as something like 39% in '92, but he didn't win any electoral votes.
Was he an independent? Forgive me.
He was it Freedom Party? It was a party like Wallace. Wallace was the American Independent Party, but he was really an independent. He used the vehicle of a political party, which existed really solely for his campaign. But I mean, there's not many times in modern U.S. history that you have a third-party candidate who makes a difference. When I vote, usually you see the two major candidates at the top of the ballot, and then usually I let my eyes kind of go down the ballot, and I usually see a bunch of names I haven't heard of before, or political parties I haven't heard of in some cases. And Perot, I would say Wallace, and you have to go back to probably Teddy Roosevelt of 1912 in terms of someone who could be decisive in terms of denying a victory to one of the major candidates and possibly then being able to cut a deal with the one closest to your image. And so Wallace was, I would say, was really a symbol of a huge political shift that was going on beginning in the 1960s in terms of, millions of moderate Democrats, especially in the South, were either becoming Republicans or eventually neocons, or they were beginning to split ticket vote. They might have voted for Eisenhower as president, but still vote, like West Virginia, they vote Republican at the top of the ticket, but at the local levels, it's still one party in a lot of the South. So there's huge currents that are beginning to shift, especially in the South. I think Wallace really capitalized on those at the right time, taking a campaign and a message that really had no future outside of Alabama, but turning it into a national message beginning in 1968.
To clarify for the audience, Hubert Humphrey became the Democratic nominee in 1968. It's sort of, I feared that it may have sounded like George Wallace became the Democratic nominee. George Wallace was the third party candidate. My producers were telling me in my year that he was the head of the Reform Party. That's what it was in '68. So we've got
or Perot.
Ross Perot. Thank you. That's right, Ross Perot. So we had George Wallace, who was perhaps is like the RFK figure today, an outsider, kind of third party candidate who's a challenger. We have obviously the Nixon and Trump parallel, and perhaps the Hubert Humphrey and Biden parallel. But again, Biden could be like Johnson and bow out because of unpopularity and health reasons, so we may not know who the Hubert Humphrey candidate is. Forgive me for kind of rehashing that, but I just want to make it really clear, because a lot of Americans, including me, prior to reading this book, really just didn't know anything.
I wasn't born either, so I had to learn it myself. Yeah.
Yes. It's amazing how I've become experts on times that I wasn't born in. So, okay. So now that we have this cast of characters, and now that we see some parallels between '68 and 2024, why do you say that this election between Humphrey, Wallace, and Nixon was the year that broke politics?
Well, and certainly it's not the only year where politics appears to be broken. I think a lot of people today would say it doesn't look like it's running the way our founders intended today either. But I think you look at '68, and as I said, the divisions in the nation and around the world, the subtitle is Chaos and Collusion, and it has kind of this image of Johnson and Nixon and their famous silhouettes. That's the message that it suggests, is that there was something else going on behind the scenes. And I think what the most controversial argument that I make in the book is that Johnson ultimately came to prefer Richard Nixon as a successor to LBJ for LBJ's own political legacy. And to me, this is a fascinating idea that, as someone who typically views politics from the cheap seats, looking at sort of actors on a stage, I think that there's really an idea in this book that what if at key moments in U.S. history, politics is not as we've been told it is. And it's really kind of a fascinating idea to think about other moments like this where it's not, and that made a difference. And I remember one White House attorney told me once, despite party labels, despite politics, an awful lot that happens in this town happens for personal selfish reasons. And here's a case where LBJ saw that a moderate, even in the other party, was better for his own legacy.
That moderate being Nixon.
That moderate being Nixon. And so that's the idea that politics was broken, is that it actually didn't work the way we've been told, or the way that it's supposed to be. You would think that a president, of course, wants to be, as a successor, his own vice president, in the case of Humphrey, or someone from your own political party. And it shows that's not always how it really happens when personalities and egos come into play, which as a historian, we look at records. And it's hard. Records don't say a lot about personal relationships. They don't say a lot about, what people were saying behind the scenes in this conversation on the front of the book. And I think the fact is that it shows that politics is different sometimes.
It's amazing that you just called Richard Nixon a moderate, because a lot of people today, both left and right, would say, Richard Nixon was a moderate. There's this idea that he was this super, super, super far right person. First of all, why do you characterize him as a moderate at that time? And why did Lyndon Johnson, as you argue, come to support him?
Well, it was Herblock, the cartoonist, who sort of showed Nixon coming out of the sewer every 4 years to campaign for some election. And I think oftentimes a Republican is vilified as far right or conservative.
Always.
Even recently, with the debacle over the Speaker of the House selection with Kevin McCarthy standing down, you could see many of the mainstream media accounts becoming sort of tongue-tied over what to call these insurgents in the House. I saw one article saying they were far right, one saying they were populist Republicans. And it seems to me these terms that we use, which are intended to clarify, often confuse, because on a lot of issues, the terms don't make any sense. And I think, in fact, it's usually the establishment and the insurgents in both parties, I think, are terms that work better. But Nixon was on the Eisenhower wing of the party. He believed in internationalism, NATO, U.S. aid to help rebuild Europe after World War II. He was always supported civil rights. He was really kind of closer to the Eisenhower, Henry Cabot Lodge side of the party as opposed to Taft or Goldwater. And I think consistently, and we're beginning to see it now with more records come out, I think we see Nixon with a bit more 20/20 hindsight than the political commentary done at the time. But I think Nixon was always a moderate, always a figure of compromise in politics.
So, because Johnson supported, as you argue, ended up kind of favoring or supporting Nixon, why do you then say that this is the year that broke politics? A lot of people would say, well, maybe that's the year that made politics if we have a Democrat who kind of came around to seeing that there was a different leader in the opposing political party who was better positioned to lead the country.
Well, I think if you look at the year, so many aspects of it, whether the whole year was broken. It wasn't just politics. I mean, the assassinations of Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy. You had this war that seemed to have no end. Again, young people kind of positioned against their parents and stirred up on campuses, against the draft in Vietnam. I think what you have is you have the political establishment in the 1968 election didn't seem to have the answers on either side. A lot of voters wanted an alternative. They didn't want the establishment anymore. I think a lot of Democrats ultimately turned on Humphrey because the phrase uses he was the old politics when they were interested in the new politics. So I think maybe perhaps another parallel to today's era, sort of establishment politicians didn't seem to have the answers to the nation's challenges, and a lot of young people on both sides don't see older politicians in their parties as reflecting their values, as speaking for their issues, or being as they see it, the future of their party. I think that's true on both sides of the aisle in 1968 as well as today.
I see you're characterizing it as really a major shakeup in politics because it takes an extraordinary kind of set of circumstances for the incumbent to step down, for an outsider to come in and have such outsized influence, and even for the previous president to, even if only in privately, favor a person of the opposing side. I see what you mean.
And that shakeup was really because what became the silent majority was beginning to take shape. I mean, Nixon coined that term. He wasn't the first one to use it. FDR used the forgotten man during the Depression. It goes back to the mid-19th century. But Nixon was the one who really articulated it in his speech of November 3rd, 1969, the silent majority speech, where he really went after them. I mean, for a Republican president to go after blue-collar and lower-middle-class voters, and a lot of moderate Democrats. And the evidence in the book that really allows me to make this controversial argument that Johnson preferred Nixon was Reverend Billy Graham's diary. So here we're introducing another person who seems to have no connection at all to everything we've been talking about up till now. But in the middle of this research, I could never have planned it. The Reverend Billy Graham died at age 99 in February of 2018. And his diary began to be opened. And it's still a process that continues to this day, controlled by the Grahams at the Graham Library in Charlotte. And Graham's diary documented verbatim contact with presidents, their staffs, and first families beginning in 1950 with Harry Truman, and it goes all the way to Barack Obama in 2014. And in the 1968 election, Graham operated as a messenger between Johnson and Nixon, and they were actively passing messages back and forth. And the peak of this activity, just after Labor Day in 1968, is Graham comes into the Oval Office and gives Johnson a message and says, now this is still speculative, the idea of a Nixon presidency in Labor Day of 68. And it says, as president, Nixon will never criticize you by name. He'll give you credit for Vietnam when it's all over. He'll do everything he can to give you a great place in history. I know of no other event like this in modern American politics where Nixon has effectively given Johnson all the ammunition to blow up his campaign at that point. I mean, imagine if that had leaked, but it didn't leak. And so it helps me to make this argument that this is in fact what Johnson wanted. He I use the phrase came to believe Nixon would be a better successor because the chaos of that year I think also affected Lyndon Johnson, and he was very concerned that he'd be blamed for losing a war by being succeeded by a Democrat who would cut and run, would get out of the war. And a lot of his Great Society initiatives, he'd be outspent, that he'd be given credit for starting them, but he'd be forgotten in history. And so allowing to be succeeded by Nixon would hold the line on Vietnam and would settle it in a way similar to the way Johnson had managed the war. And under Nixon, to the, many conservatives were not happy about this during the Nixon presidency. The size of government didn't shrink under a Republican after the Great Society. It actually grew after Johnson's Great Society. So I would look at, how did this agreement go? I think they kept, this was the agreement they had in 68, and I think both sides kept their end of the agreement. Johnson dies 4 years later in January of 73. But this causes me to view not just this election in a whole new way, but causes me to view the Nixon presidency in a whole new way. The idea that there could be one voter on a ranch in Stonewall, Texas, who could be a powerful force holding back congressional Democrats in the House and Senate. And he continues to sort of block and help Nixon during his 5.5-year presidency.
We see that most elections have a very similar pattern. Democrat versus Republican, Bush versus Gore, Obama versus McCain, Obama versus Romney, Trump versus Clinton. And then we have these kind of shake-up years, 68 and 2024. I doubt that Joe Biden, like Lyndon Johnson, will maybe privately come to see that Donald Trump is better positioned, if he is the nominee, or whoever the Republican nominee is better positioned to carry the country forward in this moment than he is. However, and I'm very interested to hear what you think of this theory, especially with what has just recently happened in Israel, I sort of wonder if there isn't going to be a significant shakeup among Democrats, among progressives, who may start to kind of see, despite their hatred of the Republican Party, despite their hatred of Donald Trump, that there may be someone better than the one in their own party to lead us through. I mean, obviously, the economy has really fallen under President Biden with inflation. I think a lot of people, both Democrats and Republicans, are stunned about this border issue. Over 7 million undocumented immigrants have flooded into our country in 3 years. People saw what happened with the withdrawal in Afghanistan. They saw President Biden say that a minor incursion by Russia in Ukraine might be acceptable, and then 36 days later, Putin invades Ukraine. And I think they're seeing now with Israel that President Biden gave $6 billion to the Iranian regime, has been giving aid to Hamas, giving aid to Gaza, and acknowledging in leaked documents that it would probably go to Hamas and not to the civilians who need it. I wonder if things aren't getting kind of so bad and so blatantly, obviously broken as they were in 68 with the Vietnam War and and the assassinations and all of those things that you mentioned. I wonder if there won't be a kind of symmetry where even some progressives might want to go with the Republican because things have just gotten very broken. What do you think?
Well, I think the Biden presidency, sort of by definition, is a brief transitional presidency. The question is, what are we transitioning to? Go back to those primaries, in 2020. Biden didn't win any of those primaries. Everybody else quit and dropped out.
Yes.
I mean, it's incredible. You look
in
at
Iowa and New Hampshire, he came like 4th and 5th.
And the person who attacked him the most was Kamala Harris,
I know.
during the big debate.
I know.
But, even go back to 2008. I mean, Hillary Clinton was leading the party until mid-June, and then all of a sudden drops out, gives it to Obama. There must have been some quid pro quo that if you support me, you can have choice of jobs. But there's a lesson of this book and all this, is that this is 55 years later. And a lot of people say, well, why are we still talking about this? You just mentioned so many more pressing issues today.
Right.
But the fact is, this is a reminder of what history is that it usually takes about 50 years before records to be declassified and opened. When people die, things like diaries get opened up. And, I'll be glad to come back on your show in 55 years and we can talk through this period and make sense of it. But this is the thing, there's an awful lot that we don't know that's going on behind the scenes, and we might not ever learn, or it could take a very long time to make sense of this. I think we are in the midst of another political realignment, much like the 1960s. But because we're sitting right here in the eye of the storm, we can't see it. We can't see what's going on. We see sort of the collateral damage of it, the debris kind of flying around, so to speak. But we don't have the hindsight yet to make sense of it or figure out where we're headed.
I couldn't agree more with you, and we're going to continue with this discussion, but I'd like to quickly tell the audience about my pillow. I use many MyPillow products. I walk into work every day wearing my slippers. I sleep on the MyPillow. I sleep on the Giza Dream bed sheets, and I use the My Towels, just to name a few. And you can get many of these products at a discount if you use the promo code Hartman, which is my last name, spelled Hartman. For a limited time, you'll get 60% off of the Giza Dream bed sheets. That comes with a 60-day money-back guarantee and a 10-year warranty. You'll get a set for as low as $39.99. Just go to mypillow.com and click on the radio listener square or call 1-800-566-6745 and use the promo code Hartman. Mr. Nichter, you were just talking about the fact that some things may be going on behind the scenes that we're not aware of right now, but that may come out in a few years that will make this moment more understandable. I mean, we already have kind of seen this over the past few years with something like the Twitter files and the FBI's meeting with Twitter to suppress conservative content and to quash the Hunter Biden story in the lead up of the 2020 election. So it's, some people who may say it's a conspiratorial claim, well, they should look at history. And of course, in your book, you outline a lot of crazy things that were going on behind the scenes that are shocking to learn about, but they do provide a kind of warning or a roadmap for today. One of them is the Chenault affair. Can you please tell the audience, what was the Chenault affair and why was it important?
Sure. The Chenault affair is named for Anna Chenault, who was I would call her a Republican socialite. She hosted some of the best parties in all of Washington at her penthouse place in the Watergate, right on the Potomac. It was a beautiful place, and it was the place to be on a lot of evenings in Washington.
Sounds fun.
And she, I guess the best way to describe her is allegations have existed for about 50 years that during the 1968 presidential election, that Nixon colluded with a foreign power. It sounds a bit like 2016.
Yes, it does.
Except in Nixon in 68, it was South Vietnam. And it was Nixon arguing to South Vietnam, don't take part in Lyndon Johnson's peace talks because as president, you'll get a better deal from me. So the Chenault affair is the idea that Nixon, with the help of Anna Chenault, were passing messages to South Vietnamese leadership to not participate in the peace talks, which started in Paris in May of 1968. And this has been on the public record since January of 1969, and it's been accepted basically as gospel truth. I learned it in college and grad school, and I heard it so many times.
I learned it in a Vietnam War class.
I assumed it was either true or at least mostly true. And I think, it doesn't make me popular at academic conferences to say this, but an awful lot of modern political history is not rigorously researched, is based on preconceived ideas. And just because every book tells the same story or cites the same source doesn't mean it's true. And it lasts this way in history because very few people go back and check the actual sources. And so I interviewed Anna Chenault at the Watergate place and the South Vietnamese, and no one who ever written about this has done those things. And I conclude in the book that the Chenault affair doesn't really prove much of anything that was going on, that there's no direct evidence at all that Richard Nixon sabotaged peace talks, interfered. And actually, I make the argument in the appendix of the book that the only real interest in this in recent years, which is, 2016, 2017, there's a spike of interest right after the 2016 election when Donald Trump is elected and is his president-elect. And the allegations started almost immediately of Russian collusion or somehow Vladimir Putin had assisted with his election, that Trump had conspired with a foreign power to steal an election from a Democrat. And the Chenault affair provided a roadmap for how a Republican did this once before by stealing an election. And in fact, if you go back and look at the sources, I don't think it really adds up to much of anything, despite the fact that it's been gospel truth for 50 years.
So your verdict is that the Chenault affair was totally bogus.
There's no doubt that that Nixon was in touch with the South Vietnamese. That Chenault, who had a business in South Vietnam, she had shipping contracts for the CIA and was carrying bars of gold during the Vietnam War, and supplies with Air America. There's no doubt they had contact. But as far as I can tell, that contact was routine. And the idea that they sabotaged an election or peace in Vietnam, which I don't think there was a scintilla of evidence that peace in Vietnam was even possible in the year 1968.
That was the year of the war that they sent the most troops. I mean, it was
absolutely the only nation that wanted out in 1968 was the United States. The South Vietnamese didn't want the war to end. The North Vietnamese, this was not a civil war, despite what many history books say. The North Vietnamese wanted to it was a military dictatorship that wanted to conquer South Vietnam and overtake it by force. So I think much of that year, now with hindsight, and we can look at it perhaps a little more dispassionately, it doesn't appear at all, what we were told for two generations of Americans have learned.
So you say that the Chennault affair, despite the contact that Richard Nixon was having with the South Vietnamese, this idea, coined the Chennault affair, that he was colluding with the South Vietnamese to delay a peace is not true.
Absolutely.
Just to verify.
Not true.
Okay. So going back to my college class on the Vietnam War, what I remember is this argument that when Nixon came into power in 1968, he didn't immediately end the Vietnam War. He kind of delayed it, kicked the can down the road until 1972 to have a kind of delayed peace or a withdrawal, an ending to the Vietnam War that wouldn't look so much like a defeat for the United States. Of course, it did end up looking like a very catastrophic defeat. But I also learned that half of the around 60,000 American deaths in the Vietnam War occurred during Nixon's presidency, during those last 4 years of the war. Is it true that Nixon kicked the can down the road to kind of save face for himself or for the United States? Or is that also misunderstood like some other aspects of Nixon's presidency?
Nixon recorded 3,400 hours of secret Oval Office tapes. There's no evidence on those tapes that he delayed it to save face or anything like that. I think he wanted to. 68 was the first election where both major candidates, Humphrey and Nixon, each campaigned that they were going to get out of the war in different ways on different timetables. I think Humphrey promised to do more quickly. But it was Richard Nixon who was the first one to pull troops out. He had the first troops pulled out in the summer of 1969, so 6 months into his presidency. That was something that Kennedy and Johnson promised but never did. So I think Nixon saw that it was unpopular, that public opinion was going a certain way, and I would say he acted as quickly as he possibly could have. Most American scholars embrace the argument that you laid out there. But if you actually talk to American scholars who understand a language beyond English, for example, Vietnamese, and have done research in Vietnamese archives, I spent about a month doing research there for my last two books. The Vietnamese scholars will say there was no chance for peace. That what do you do? I mean, as the United States, do you just abandon your ally? Well, what did we do with rebuilding Japan after World War II, or rebuilding Germany? The United States has commitments all around the world at any given time, and treaty alliances that have to be defended. We had, a number of other allies fighting alongside of us, South Koreans, the Australians. This wasn't just our decision to make. So I would argue, those who read Vietnamese and understand less conditioned by the American politics and see more the geopolitics, of the Vietnam War, I don't know of any expert, even ones who are not friends of Richard Nixon's, who would say, that's the whole thing. It's easy to criticize,
right.
But the answer is instead of what? What would we have done instead?
Just pull out. People would say just pull out. In 1969, just all out withdrawal. That would be their argument.
I would say that's not possible because of our commitment to the region. And Nixon was also worried about China. What would happen with China in terms of who would fill that? The lesson of Vietnam is when the power pulls out, someone fills that vacuum. When the French left in 1954, Ho Chi Minh moved in, and I think ultimately wanted to conquer all of what was called French Indochina.
Right.
So if the United States were to pull out, the irony is we've learned in recent declassified records, the Chinese didn't want the Americans to pull out because the Chinese feared that the Russians could move in.
Oh, I see.
And sort of corner China on both sides. Russia was more involved in Laos after the 1962 Laos Accords, which was another peace agreement that tried to calm the former French Indochina region down. I think there were a lot of reasons why Nixon took time to do it the right way. And it's easy to criticize, but I'm not sure what he could have done better.
People kind of disparage the domino theory as absurd. The domino theory coined by Eisenhower, for those who are unaware, is that if we let one more country succumb to communism, then like a domino, many other countries would fall. People laugh at that, go, how absurd. Well, and look, obviously I probably, like you, have complicated feelings about the Vietnam War, but the Vietnam War did prove to powers like China, like Russia, other surrounding nations, that there would be a cost to their adopting communism. And I think at the very least that was valuable for people to see. On a separate note, for those who are not as familiar, and even despite reading your book, my memory of this is getting a little rusty. Can you synopsize how Richard Nixon pulled out of the Vietnam War? What exactly happened, and what's your assessment of it, good or bad?
Well, first on the domino theory, it's easy for Americans to criticize this theory that maybe makes sense or doesn't make sense, but talk to the dominoes themselves.
Exactly.
The nations. Yeah. And Indonesia is a good example. Indonesia was also nearly the largest Muslim nation in the world, and also one of the biggest kind of anchors of that whole region in terms of trade and strategic location. Almost was overtaken by communism. I mean, that was a domino that teetered on the edge, and with support, we stood it back up. And so I would say talk to the dominoes. When you have those kinds of concerns. I think Nixon campaigned, he said very little about Vietnam in 1968, and it's been written up that he had a secret plan to end the war. And in fact, this was largely a creation by the Associated Press. Nixon never said he had a secret plan to end the war. At the New Hampshire primary, he was asked by the press, "What's your plan in Vietnam?" And he didn't say very much. And what he did, he sort of tapped his pocket on his jacket as if to say, "Oh, it's right in there, my plan." And that became the secret plan. I think what Nixon did in 68, not just on Vietnam, but on so many issues, his strategy was to say as little as possible and run out the clock. He was ahead the whole year. He didn't want to say anything that could offend Lyndon Johnson because Johnson wasn't hurting him in 68. I think that this is a whole new way of seeing the Johnson-Nixon relationship, why Nixon really said so little about a lot of policies. I think Nixon's strategy on Vietnam was to end it in a way that was harmonious with LBJ, that would preserve as much credibility for LBJ as possible and his legacy. Of course, it is a stain on LBJ's legacy. And so I think Nixon understood that Americans couldn't dictate. The Johnson peace talks, led by Ambassador Averell Harriman and future Secretary of State Cyrus Vance, largely dictated to our ally, South Vietnam, how the U.S. was going to do this. Because our negotiations were only with the communists, with North Vietnam. Our ally, South Vietnam, wasn't even part of the talks in 1968. It's absurd to think that here's the United States coming in, and we're going to have negotiations about the future of Vietnam, but you're not actually allowed to take part or have a say in those talks in Paris. So first of all, Nixon put South Vietnam at the table beginning in January of 1969 at an expanded talks. He gave them an official voice, and he took time to make sure their views were incorporated. Now, at the end of the day, the South Vietnamese were reminded, just as it said Truman lost China, that Chiang Kai-shek was advising the South Vietnamese, Park in Korea was advising to in Vietnam, saying, the Americans are eventually going to get tired and go home. And that's what happened, in 1973, and then the fall of Saigon in 1975.
And continued
the
to
U.S.
happen.
And I think that's a lesson of U.S. foreign policy.
Yes.
In the 20th century, we lost interest in Taiwan, and then there was communist takeover in 1949 of the mainland China, as it was called then. And similar with the Korean War, stalemated after 6 months in 1950.
Iraq, Afghanistan, perhaps Ukraine.
Americans frequently get into a war in some part of the world that many Americans can't find on a map. And we're all gung-ho initially, in the fog of war, and then we get tired of it after a while, and commitments don't really matter. But I think Nixon was more principled than that. Allies mattered, including South Vietnam at the talks mattered, and I think doing it in a way that it preserved maximum credibility, maximum face for the United States of America and its allies was fundamentally his strategy.
We have only a little bit amount of time left, and I so wish that we could get into the Watergate discussion. But you know what? You'll have to come back, and we will have that discussion. Probably a good thing to give the audience a little bit of a breather between these big subjects we've talked about so much today. But in closing, how has the 1968 election informed politics and journalism in the after decades and up until today?
I have two takeaways. I think, first of all, the 1960s is probably the other era, much like today, when millions of Americans have lost faith in our nation's institutions, whether it be political parties, whether it be mainstream media, whether it be higher ed, government, organized religion. I think a lot of these themes for younger people today were similar for younger people in the 1960s. And as an optimist, there's not a lot of optimism in the year 1968, but I think there's ultimately a message here of optimism as well when you finish this book, because in the 1960s, there was a lot of talk in the media of the sky was falling. The world's going to end. We were being torn apart at home on our campuses, a war around the world. And as I said, politics seemed to be broken in terms of the political establishment, but we got through it. And perhaps our nation was even stronger as a result. And I think it's a lesson that we will get through. We got through the 1960s. We can get through today as well.
I really, really hope that you're right. Thank you so much for coming in today. And thank you so much for writing this very important book. As a reminder to the audience, the book is The Year That Broke Politics, about the 1968 election. And now you can go to a dinner party and know a lot more about the 68 election than you did. Not that these historical discussions are just for dinner party chatter. But that's what some people sadly only care about. But thank you so much again for your time. And thank you all for listening. I'll see you soon.